Quality.
We're good. Is everybody good?
Yes.
Comments?
Of course.
Y'all, audience?
Is it okay if I record?
I'll
Yeah, we'll send it to you. It's all good. All right.
Is it okay if I record?
Of course.
Wait, can I?
All right. You all good? Let's get this show going. We affirm contention one is keeping the band together. The EU is disunified now, as Fisher writes, even on the most fundamental issues concerning the European project. However, the EU joining the BRI as a bloc preserves EU unity in two ways. The first is reaching consensus. McKay's 19 writes that the EU is more divided than ever on China. Some countries, such as Greece and Hungary, are enthusiastic about cooperation. Others, such as Sweden, are on the fence, while France and Germany seem increasingly hostile, seeing a growing economic threat. Smith 19 furthers, writing that EU countries like France and Germany are resentful of China's attempt to court and negotiate separately with Eastern and Central European countries because it is seen as attempting to undermine consensus and weaken their negotiating position. The second warrant is preventing Chinese mischief. McKay's of the Asian Review in 2019 writes that China wants to weaken EU unity to build strong relations with individual nations. For that reason, China is enticing countries to reopen debate on EU issues. For example, Italy's coalition government wants to open EU issues where it feels it has been disadvantaged by a Berlin-dominated union. That includes migration, budget rules, and monetary policy, but such issues can rarely be opened. The EU does not wish to create the political space for such debate because it could literally break the bloc apart. The question of working with China is different because Beijing, not Berlin, has the final word. Italy's populist-led government has jumped at the chance. EU states can use the China lever to reopen controversial EU issues, going far beyond bilateral economic ties. Problematically, Brianko 19 writes that if the EU legislature suffers from this gridlock, many reforms under discussion won't happen. Even worse, they might not be able to respond to an economic crisis, as Ewing of the New York Times in 2019 writes that EU stimulus, dependent on EU's ability to legislate, was needed to prevent the collapse of the Eurozone. Terminally, Weirder of the Financial Times in 2011 writes that the resulting financial crisis would trigger a global depression that would last for years, with GDP likely falling more than 10% and unemployment in the West reaching 20% or more, dragging down emerging markets as well. Our second contention is reform. Our first subpoint is a response. Jack Progress 18 of the South China Morning Post writes that in response to the BRI, Trump passed a bipartisan bill known as the BUILD Act, giving $60 billion of loans and investment into primarily developing nations. This act is meant to combat the expansion of Chinese BRI influence and offers a better alternative. Fortunately, Tuleser 2019 explains that the EU's participation in the BRI represents a political, economic, and diplomatic setback for the U.S. As seen through the BUILD Act, the way the U.S. responds to these perceptual setbacks is historically through increasing investment in key regions. Thus, the EU joining will spark more U.S. investment. And Interaction 18 writes that USAID, one of the agencies within the BUILD Act, has already lifted 23.4 million out of poverty. This isn't just U.S. investment, though, as Ghana writes that Japan and India increased their investment in response as well. This creates a race to the top, not only for quantity, but also quality of development infrastructure investment that massively benefits all recipients. With evidence from competitive Japanese investments, Harris of the Stimson Center concludes that even limited engagement could challenge China and its businesses to aspire to higher standards. Our second subpoint is cooperation. Thing 19 explains that the collective participation of EU nations in the BRI will bring about the integration of Chinese and European standards and rules. This has happened in the past. For example, China's Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, or AIIB, the EU joining has led to better standards. Huijtjens 19 contextualizes that there is an increasing consensus that Western banks have led the AIIB to align its standards with those of those banks, for example, on issues of climate change, gender, and transparency. If the EU joined the BRI, they would improve it in the same way. Bing continues that as a leader in formulating engineering and technical standards, rules on international investment and trade, Europe has put forward principles of sustainable, comprehensive, and rules-based connectivity. The impact of this reform is reducing poverty. The World Bank concludes that a reformed BRI can bring up to 32 million out of poverty, but only if reforms take place, as there are a number of problems in the BRI, such as debt sustainability, that prevent the BRI from reducing poverty as effectively as it could. Thus, we are proud to affirm.
All right. Can I see Ghana? And can I also see Riyadh, I think it is?
Yeah.
What's the most colored? Riyadh. Ghana and Riyadh.
Here's comment.
Alright, cool.
Oh, yeah. Alright.
Okay, that was 676 total.
Okay. Everybody good? Andrew and I negate our sole contention is ending disasters. BRI lending has shrunk dramatically in recent years, as Meyer, a Wharton professor, finds in 2019 that BRI lending by major Chinese banks has dropped 89% since 2015, and lending by commercial banks has ceased almost entirely due to financial issues domestically. Essentially, the Belt Road Initiative is on full-on crisis mode, as Lansing concludes in 2019 that the BRI is doomed to failure if it cannot leverage third-party financing with the European Union as the ideal funder. There are two areas where there are numerous benefits. Thus, subpoint A is preventing debt disasters. First is in Europe. BRI investments are incredibly expensive and lead to high levels of debt. As for example, 10 of the Financial Times in 2019 explains that through the BRI, China has thrown billions of dollars into investing in projects that lead little to no economic benefit, which is why they currently have over $28 trillion in debt with a debt to GDP ratio of 280%. Thankfully, major European countries are ready to invest in, as the European Union has not joined as a bloc. Now would be the worst time for high debt levels in Europe, as Elliott of The Guardian in 2018 finds that Eurozone growth has slumped to the lowest in years and is currently at high risk of a recession. The impact of high national debt is being unprepared to combat recessions. As Giladucci in 2018 explains, that high debt constrains countries' abilities to pass stimulus packages and pro-growth policies to mitigate the effects of a recession, which is why Tully of Fortune in 2018 finds that countries with high debt don't respond aggressively to economic downturns. Indeed, Romer in 2017 confirms that recessions with a high debt to GDP ratio last on average 66% longer. This hits developing nations the hardest, as a recent report from the IMF finds that the next crisis could push 900 million people into poverty. Time is of the essence during a recession, as a 2009 report from Oxfam finds that every 1 minute in a recession, 100 people are pushed into poverty. Second is through the Belt Road Initiative itself. The National Review in 2018 finds that the heart of the Belt Road Initiative is debt trap diplomacy, where China gives loans for projects with high interest rates and short repayment periods. Already, debt in 2019 finds that BRI countries have high debt owed to China, which is increasing their risk of default now. Hurley in 2018 finds that 23 countries are currently in debt distress in the European and in the BRI specifically due to these debt traps. Currently, the European Union is leveraging China, as Jonathan Bouchard in 2018 finds that the European Union is currently pressuring China to adopt EU standards for its projects that would stop debt traps in BRI countries, with China currently willing to listen. Indeed, Das Gupta in 2019 finds that China is currently reforming these areas due to growing criticism. However, Smith in 2019 finds that if more European members join, then China has less of a reason to reform these areas, as the country believes that they have successfully solved these problems where in reality they haven't. When these countries have high levels of debt, they are forced to make austerity cuts, which raises taxes while simultaneously drastically making cuts to crucial poverty alleviation programs such as job programs and educational programs. Unfortunately, Gomez in 2018 finds that these types of programs contribute to growing poverty in countries. Subpoint B is going green. Green tech is becoming increasingly affordable now, as Matt Egan in 2019 reports that the price of renewables has decreased 90% in recent years and is continuing to decrease now, which is why Comfort Greenbiz in 2019 reports that countries are switching their focus to rolling out renewable energy now in the developing world. Lee in 2018 explains that due to this, it is possible to create a fully renewable world that avoids the 2-degree tipping point that everyone says is so harmful. Unfortunately, Hilton in 2019 finds that domestic regulation within China has forced fossil fuel companies to spread their services through the BRI in hopes of survival. Indeed, Nakanto in 2019 finds that 90% of BRI energy projects have to do with fossil fuels, which will drastically increase emissions, which is why Zadek in 2019 finds that these countries are then locked into using dirty infrastructure for decades, as it involves long-term planning and governmental changes, which is why he ultimately concludes that the BRI, if it continues, could account for 50% of global emissions up by 2050 and up from 15% now. A ton of the scientific journal finds in a meta-analysis that for every 1 percentage point increase in temperature, crop yield declines as a result by 7%. This has a tangible impact on cultures that rely on subsistence agriculture, as Ray of Greenbiz terminalizes that every year climate change ramps up, consumable food calories will become more and more difficult to attain, cutting off the food for 50 million people who depend on it. Thus, we are proud to negate.
We can sit if you want, if that's cool. Up to you.
Why not?
Alright.
So, starting now, what does EU, like, what what's your first warrant on your first supplement?
So our first one is that when the European Union joins the BRI and Euroworld, they're gonna take on a significant amount of debt. This is
Why?
really bad, well, because they're gonna finance the project. We say the link is that the European Union is going to fund it. Because our Meyer evidence says, A, they are the most ideal funder, and B, France and Germany, the two biggest members of the European Union, are currently willing to put down that funding.
So what mechanism would they use to fund the BRI? Like,
They
what's,
would probably give China money.
no, but like, what's the financial institution that they would use to fund the BRI?
I don't think we can possibly
No, I
specify a
think you do know. I
financial
think
institution.
the AIB is the financial institution.
What is the AIB?
It is the Asian Infrastructure Investment Bank, and it is the chief foreign funder
Okay.
of the BRI.
So two
Who
questions.
is in the
Two questions.
AIB?
Okay, so obviously I don't know the answer because I've never
France
heard of
and
the
Germany.
AIB, but let me make this explicitly clear. It's literally the Asian, financial institute. We say that the European Union is going to fund it. There is no distinctive warrant or any evidence that exists that says they're gonna fund it through this.
I would
Can I ask
say-
you a question?
Sure.
Okay, so, I guess on your first contention, right? So what is your link into the status, what is your link into the recession impact is my
I
question.
mean, we
overall.
both agree that a recession's pretty likely.
Yeah, sure,
Okay.
but what's your link into that?
It's like there's not going to be, so it's like EU legislation is needed for fiscal stimulus because the EU needs to pass fiscal stimulus.
Sure.
And that goes away when you gridlock the EU.
I have a question.
Sure.
If I'm a Congress maker, or if I'm a congressperson, right, and I see that my country is literally in a massive downturn and the economy is going to crap, we're in a recession, what incentive do I have not to pass fiscal stimulus?
I mean, there's a lot of political incentives not to want to pass fiscal stimulus. There's some pretty good reasons
I
not
mean,
to.
I
And the
don't know, I
warrants
feel
that-
like-
Also, that's not really responsive to the warrants about how China is going to try to exert its leverage over EU nations, or the warrant about how getting everybody on the same
I would say
page about
specifically back to
BRI
the
is
funding
probably
point,
beneficial.
I feel like if Congress people are in a position where there is a massive economic downturn going on, their bases and the people that voted them into office are probably gonna pressure them to
I don't
pass some
think-
kind of stimulus.
I don't know
That's what's
how the
empirically
EU
happens.
works exactly, but I
Yeah.
don't think they're elected.
Well, that's-
I don't think the
well-
EU, the commissioners.
Well, that's fair,
are
the
elected.
commissioners are different than the local representatives in the country, that's fine. Do you have a question?
So what does the study that Zedek cites conclude?
Yeah, so the Zedek evidence says that right
No.
now,
What does the study that he cites conclude?
I mean, I can read what we read in case, which is what I was
Okay.
gonna do.
Sure, go ahead.
Okay, so what we say is that currently BRI countries account for 15% of global emissions. That number drives.
Wait.
I was
Yes,
explaining.
so what is a BRI country? Is China a BRI country?
China's a member of the BRI, they're the
Okay.
founding member of the Belt and Road
That's
Initiative.
just important to point out.
Our argument is that this drastically increases because you see something called the lock-in effect, because China is spreading their coal industry abroad, that is going to lead to.
But if
a
they're
lock-in effect.
moving the coal out of China
Yeah,
and into these developing nations,
Yeah.
how is there a net increase in emissions if they're moving
because
it?
the coal industries, that's our warrant, we say it's an
Wait,
industrial.
but they're moving it from one BRI nation.
So I was trying to answer your question, but I was cut off. So our argument is that the coal going from China to developing countries is going to monopolize and lead to a lot more coal in these countries than what we currently see in China.
Can I see the deck?
Yeah. Oh wait, no, I have the card. Wait a sec. Okay, yeah, Zedek is right there.
Can you-
Sure. 6 seconds. Actually, can I see the part that France and Germany are willing to invest? And then there's one more part after that.
Here you go. Just talks about how France is going to be. Yep.
Okay, sure. And I also see the, China reforming now.
There you go. Yeah, it's the bigger font than that, but highlight.
Sure. That was 14 seconds.
So you only use 14 seconds through everything? I'm sure.
I don't think we used prep before that.
Yeah, I think that's right, okay.
Yeah.
Good.
Is everybody ready? It's gonna, I guess, just be downspace.
Starting at the top of their case, they have to prove that EU countries are willing to finance the BRI in order to get access to any of their impacts, but there's a few reasons why they won't. First, starting is evidence. He says that France and Germany want to fund. The card just says that they're on the same page about the goals of the BRI. It doesn't say that they are willing to fund. There's no piece of evidence out there that says the EU wants to fund, and there's a few reasons as to why the EU won't fund. The first is that these are really bad investments. Two reasons why. First, Greer says that the majority of BRI investments are done for geopolitical reasons. That's why they have negative return on investment. The second is that they're just approved randomly by lower level banks that have no incentive to actually approve good investments. That's why a lot of BRI investments are of negative return. That's why there's no investment in China right now. That's proven by the fact that 95% of BRI investment comes from China itself. China calls for private investment and international funding. They can't get it because people realize that these are really bad loans. But second is that if China EU wanted to invest, they would have done so by now. The primary mechanism for international loaning is the AIIB. Europe, the majority of European countries, including France and Germany, are already in the AIIB. That proves the fact that they're not going to invest. If they want to, they would have done so by now. But third, is if this is really so important to China, like that's the BRI, I think China is willing to go into debt themselves in order to continue the BRI. At that point, it's not unique as well. But then, let's go into the next, the first thing at the top of their case, first off point about debt diplomacy, or debt disaster. First, I'd say the impact probably disproves the link. If this is really going to send the EU into recession, that's probably another reason why the EU is not going to invest. They don't want to spend massive amounts on China's infrastructure projects. They are not going to do this. There's no reason why. If anything, I'd say EU is in a bad economic condition right now that only further incentives them to not invest in the BRI. But secondly, is I would say that China, but then let's go into this point about debt diplomacy. First, I would say that a lot of countries are doing things to prevent themselves from being debt trapped by China. For example, Italy has required screening that prevents people from taking control of their ports. But secondly, is I would say that EU would only increase the sustainability if they join. That you can cross-apply our second contention here about reform, because you see the AIB itself has improved sustainability as a result of sharing norms, as when they cooperate, their norms now closely aligned. That's empirical evidence that has resulted in actual sustainability reforms, but their evidence only says that China wants to modify its reform to sustainability. I would say China's never going to. China says a lot of things. They don't prove that these reforms have ever actually taken place. That's why for our analysis. But then, secondly, next I can say you could turn it again, because EU will only, then I'd say you can turn it because in the long term, the BRI helps resist debt traps. Common 19 writes that as a result of getting investment, it raises their credit ratings and gives them more ability to invest, and that's why in the long term, their debt sustainability actually goes up, because now they're willing to get investments. That means they can actually get higher credit ratings. Then third, you can turn it again, because the alternative Chinese loans are much, much worse. Currently, BRI countries have the alternative of IMF or Chinese loans. They're choosing Chinese loans, which proves that they're better, because IMF loans require forced austerity policies, which are really bad, because it requires cuts and things that grow the economy. That's why they're comparatively worse. But then, let's go into the next thing to talk about on climate. There's a few responses, mostly terms. First, is I would say exporting coal allows China to go green. American Progress writes that the reason China's exporting coal is because they themselves want to invest in green technology, and that's really important because China is the largest emitter of emissions. That means that if you allow China to go green, it's less emissions on net, because now they're actually primarily green tech. Then I would say China's more likely to invest in green tech over fossil fuels. There's a few reasons why. The first is that the Institute for Energy Economics and Financial Analysis writes that they want a safety net in case their domestic green technology fails, so they can invest overseas. Second is that they have an overcapacity of things of materials that allow them to invest in green tech, so they want to sell it. Third, so I would say they want a monopoly in green technology, as China is currently the leader, so they want to monopolize by investing in green technology around the world. Fourth is I would say that they're facing backlash for constructing coal, that's why they want to invest in green technology. And then fifthly, its fossil fuels are increasingly going untenable, they're unprofitable. That's why green tech is more likely to be invested in, because in the long term it's going to be cheaper. Then they say lock-in happens, there's no warrant for lock-in. If green tech cheaper, obviously they're going to switch to green tech, but then they're obviously going to switch to green tech. Then ultimately, because the study site says that currently we're on pace to pass the 2 degree threshold. That's why the study sites concludes that the only way to avoid that is by farming because of green tech.
Alright, we're gonna be running Fred. Can we see the they have overcapacity, that kind of stuff,
Yeah.
materials?
was 4 seconds.
And can we see the like domestic safety net part?
Yeah. Give me 1 second. Okay. It's like a 40-page document, and like our lab didn't cut the card, so we'll drop the card. But I guess we can like keep the analysis and just have it as like an uncarded response.
Okay, sure.
Cool.
Alright, we're gonna start at prep. Now. We have 45 seconds total for everything.
Alright, so in our case.
Start at the top. They just say our card says on the same page funding, but our card's really good on this. It says Germany and France have sort of come to meetings with China about funding the BRI and now are on the same page about funding this argument or funding this agreement, but won't do it until they get a block. The card is pretty good that says Germany and France are on the same page with them. Then they give you true reasons for why like people don't want to invest, but realize that the geopolitical power, obviously the EU wants that. So even if they're not necessarily making a finance back, they still would want to invest in it. And secondly, they're not going to join unless they actually they're not going to fund unless they get on a block because they don't really get the reap the benefits of investment. Then they say 95 for China investment. This because Odea finds in 2019 that private investors fear investing in the BRI right now because it lacks legitimacy. However, if the EU joins, that means it gains legitimacy, which means funding can come from private investors specifically. Then they talk about like the AIBE, being France already in it, but we tell you France and Germany don't want to invest now because they don't really reap the benefits because project can't really go into the EU right now. Then they say China goes into more debt. No, our Myers evidence says China's banks have ceased giving them investments, which means they can't just go into more debt like we talked about, which is why projects are canceling. And the uniqueness is on our side is 270 projects have been canceled because they don't have funding. On our first warrant, they just say the impact disproves the link. No, because a lot of developed countries tend to not really care about what happens to their debt specifically, and it's not going to cause a recession. That's not our argument. Our argument is recessions are inevitable. However, high debt means they can't prepare for a recession. Developed countries go into a lot of debt all the time, but we tell you specifically that Europe has sort of measures right now, but that only changes when they have to invest billions and trillions into the EU to try to reap a benefit. At that point, they've conceded. Our Ghilarducci evidence says that they won't be able to do a stimulus. It's crucial because Romer says this leads to 66% longer recessions, which is crucial because Oxfam says every minute 100 people go into poverty. On our second quarter, we're going to concede that there's like screens, which means that countries aren't likely to do a lot of these debt traps they talked about, which means none of their terms actually happen. But their investment term doesn't make any, their legitimacy term doesn't make any sense because what we tell you specifically is Gupta says China is making reforms right now, not just words they talk about. Go to green tech. They first tell you that China's going to go with green, that China's going to go green, just sending their emissions elsewhere. No, because developing countries are investing in green tech right now, which means emissions are not zero sum. Then they say China has a bunch of incentives, but that's the group a lot of them because it doesn't matter because Congress says 90% are still fossil fuels. They have an incentive to be domestic in green tech for all the reasons they talk about, like having like being over capacity and monopolize the market there. They have an incentive to do that within the country, but not other areas. Their monopolies, their backlash argument doesn't really make a lot of sense because China doesn't really care too much about environmental backlash, and their profitability argument doesn't make any sense because developing nations would obviously have to pay more for coal. There's a ZEC index really bad because we tell you specifically they says it leads to 50% more emissions. At that point, they really didn't interact with the warrant at all. Go to their case. At the start of their first contention, group their first two warrants for a few couple general responses. First, the heart of gridlock in the European nations, things like rising populist party, which they can't really solve for. If anything, you can turn this argument against them because one of these populist parties sees China investment going into the country to become more radical and actually lead to more of this problem happening. But secondly, their argument is really doesn't make any sense. Just because they sign on to the BRI, if countries are against the BRI, it doesn't mean they magically snap their fingers and are now pro BRI. Doesn't make they don't really warrant this out. On their consensus argument, they talk about France and Germany. Our cross-supplier car will tell you France and Germany is on board for the BRI. On their second warning, you can turn it against them because China gets more control of these regions and projects, which means they're more likely to divide these countries against them when they get more control. On their impacts, first, their card sense reforms are really unlikely right now. How much changes in a year for actually see this likely happen? But second, it doesn't matter if they can solve gridlock if their debt's high. They physically can't pass the argument. On their second contention, their first argument talks about reform. First, Balabos in 2018 finds that Trump is doing this to try to counter China, in developing nations generally, not just BRI, which means if China goes into other developing nations with other projects, things like Made in China 2025, the U.S. still has an incentive. But second, you can turn it against them because Basis in 2018 finds these countries are for profit, which means they don't actually help these developing countries and actually lead to corruption, lead to a lot more corruption in these countries, which is empirically seen. But third, the 60 billion they talked about didn't actually happen, and there was no response when Italy joined to make them prove why this actually happened when Italy joined. On their argument about cooperation, the uniqueness is definitely on our side. The disputed evidence that China is reforming right now because the EU is not in. However, the Smith evidence from case tells you that the EU joining changes a lot of this, and their argument about the AIIB doesn't make any sense because the BRI is different. The BRI is the heart of Chinese projects, not like a bank that they talk about.
We're in fake prep time. Wait, yeah, we're in fake time. Sorry, now. Should we stop prep? Can we see the Build Act as for profit?
Yeah. These are two cards. This one talks about the profit they made, and that one talks about the impact on countries. The top one talks about the impact.
Wait, what does that do with corruption? What is OPIC?
OPIC's like build funds.
Olympics the same thing as USA, pretty much.
Yeah, it's like the build project you talk about funds OPIC. And that's what, and then it talks about how OPIC made a lot of profit. And then the corruption's a different color.
Is the corruption side?
Yeah, yeah. 100%.
Literally won't pull up, so it's fine.
So it's like talks about this is like a warrant for it, and then it's talking about lending practices.
Where does the word corruption?
It's like that's talking about like the lending practices.
I can pull it up during cross. I didn't send it back
Just
file.
speed things along.
Yeah, but we're gonna keep taking crap. I know that. That was a minute 55. So a minute 55 plus 14. Cross. Okay. Everyone ready? Why are France and Germany investing in the BRI right now?
Because they don't see any of the benefits of investing in the BRI. They don't get projects in their own country. They don't see increased trade from it like that we talk about.
Sure. Nick, question.
Yeah, so I guess let's talk about your build out, right?
Mhm.
Why, what happened when Italy joined the BRI?
Investment in Italy or not?
Investment in Italy from the United States.
Yeah.
What card says that?
I can pull it up later. It says that like the U.S.'s plans
So I
to invest
guess-
in Italy.
It's like the US has plans to invest in Italy. This time kind of a long time ago, but your impact's more about like pulling millions of people out of poverty in developing countries. Why did the US not sort of give aid to developing countries when Italy joined?
Wait, no, we're saying that in response to diplomatic setbacks, we're trying to expand its soft power, which is what the BR would be, is that the U.S. responds by trying to get those countries back onto the United States side by increasing their investment.
Okay, but like US aid, the card you talk about is definitely like just the United States going into developing countries and giving aid, not like established developed countries like Italy.
U.S. aid is, yeah, it goes to developing nations, that's the
Okay,
point.
why did, yeah, you just said your point's developing nations, not like going into Italy, right? So why did they not invest in developing nation after Italy joined the BRI?
Okay, first of all, I'd say like, I don't know if they did or not, but second, and like a lot more importantly, is that the EU is like, that's a Tellerser card, it says that EU joining would be a massive diplomatic, economic, and political
There's
setback,
like-
and that's the bright line for the U.S.
But there's a lot of countries that have joined the BRI already from the EU, why does like?
I'd say the EU, the United States' largest trading partner, and like one of the largest global players, is a lot different.
Yeah,
Now, I have
but
a
every
question.
country, it should be a scalar impact, right? Every country that should join
It's
should
not
be more.
scalar, it's like, their model could be something. It's
Alright,
like-
whatever.
Yeah,
Another
I
question.
have a question. So like, why would the EU invest if it puts them into a ton of debt, especially considering they're like, a lot of them are in
Well,
recession right now?
because they see, like, well, one, it's not like every person just like knows they're gonna be a recession, is preparing for that with every like money. But second, they see that like sort of China's a lot of fear mongering for a lot of these countries. It's like saying you can make a lot of profits in the long term and you can be connected
So
to the global
they're just gonna
world.
listen to China blindly?
Well, one, it also just makes sense like logistically, like countries would wanna build ports and be connected with a major country that's like extending into a lot of these like.
But why would that
wanna be part
offset
of
them
the
considering they're in like, in a lot of them are in a recession now?
They're not really in a recession.
Italy's in a recession, Germany's like nearing a recession now, and so like a lot of them have really bad economic conditions. I'd
So
say they
like, we
probably
would say
don't-
obviously they would wanna, invest in these projects, and a lot of these countries may be like, hey, if you invest in infrastructure development, you can pull you out of a recession, which
Why would
apparently
they
just
take-
isn't true.
Why would they take on more debt if a lot of these countries are in a ton of debt right now?
Well, they're not necessarily in that much though, we tell you
I
like
mean,
things like,
like-
hold on, can I finish?
Sure.
Things like austerity measures from the last recession, I mean, they are sort of at a manageable debt path right now, but investing billions and trillions of dollars into the country means it's like unlikely. Also, just generally developed countries don't really care too much
I
about
think
debt.
they do care about debt, like the
Why is
Tea
China-
Party cares a lot about debt.
China's at
in the
like
United
280%,
States.
China's at like 280% debt to GDP ratio, the United
I'd
States
say
is
the
over
EU
100%.
cares about debt insofar as they implement austerity.
That was because after the recession.
Can I see the France and Germany wants to invest again?
Yeah. Keep on.
that was another 6 seconds. I'll just say that because I can't hold it. And then do some math. We have 210 and we have about like 45 seconds left. That's like 20 seconds, like 20 seconds, everything.
Alright.
Okay, sorry. Everybody good? Yep. Okay. So first, on their case, on the responses on investment, they say that the EU wants geopolitical power. We would argue that it should, this is primarily for China's geopolitical interests. EU isn't going to get any benefits from that. Secondly, their evidence is really, really bad. Their evidence talks about how the EU wants to join a multilateral forum related to the BRI, not that the EU has any interest in investing in the BRI specifically. Second, also, their warrant on their first contention really just proves this at all. There's no reason why the EU would ever want to go into massive amounts of debt, they're not stupid, in order to gain these, maybe they get marginal geopolitical benefits from joining up with China. Insofar as neither team has ran any advantages of the EU joining the BRI and investing in the BRI, that falls. But second, I would say that they mishandle our turns on green tech. First, they say that emissions aren't zero-sum in response to how China going green is better. That's exactly our point. Insofar as we can allow China to go green and because they're pushing out their coal companies into developing nations, I would say that that's beneficial because China as the largest emitter can on net decrease emissions globally. At that point, we access better. But second, China will invest in green tech in the long run. Their biggest response is how 90% is still fossil fuels, but that's not responsive because our impacts are about long-run trends and how we're shifting towards green tech through the BRI. That's why, because they want a monopoly. Second, because green tech is becoming cheaper in the long run. I would say that at that point, the Zedek study flows to our side. That's what the Zedek study concludes in the first place, is that the BRI through green tech is the only way that we can solve for the 2-degree scenario and solve for all of the problems that they talk about. But now in our case, why you're going to vote for us are two, first of all, on reform and the response to Trump. First, they said that to group their first two warrants, or for their first and third responses about how there's already money. I would say that it's scalar. There's more incentive to invest because China's pushing harder on these developing nations. I would say that there's more investment from the US. Second, on the turn about how companies are for profit, they never really show us a card. I would say that the corruption is not really likely in EU nations with relatively strong rules of law. And third, they talk about how Italy didn't go, what happened in Italy. Investment in Italy went up after they joined the BRI. At that point, we gain access to the Build Act and other acts that are similar, which pour billions of dollars into developmental aid for developed and developing nations, and at that point there was a race to the top for better infrastructure quality, and that's why we get access to 32 million. But also on cooperation, they say that China's reforming now, but they never show any actual reforms that China is making. Insofar as that is true, the AIIB empirical analysis is better. They give a really reductive idea of leverage as the way to solve for these international problems. I would say that nations cooperating to form a meaningful framework with one another and giving it and solving issues like climate change and gender is really, really good, because that's what happened to the AIIB, because both sides wanted to invest. At that point, we see 30 million to 32 million people brought out from poverty because of this reformed BRI. And that's really critical because we win on probability. I would say that the probability of when this reform happens is really high, considering the empirical validity of it is 100% true. That we are proud to.
Alright, we're going to be running at starting.
Oh, could we see that card that you said you were going to give us after cross?
What card is that if you asked for?
Yeah, you
I don't think it really matters.
Yeah, it's fine.
Okay. Okay. So the order's gonna be a little weird. It's gonna start on their first contention and then instantly go into my case on, like the recession argument. So the front line is like green tech and then back to their case. Yeah, of course. So I'm going to start on really quickly in response to their first contention. I'm going to quickly move over to our recessions argument and the EU funding debate. I'm going to weigh, then I'm going to go to green tech, and then I'm going to go to the offense they said. I think that makes sense. Okay. All right, is everybody good? Okay. They supercharge our link into recessions when they can see that the BRI is going to lead to more populism. The reason this is so important is because it's going to give us a secondary link into recessions because A, populism is going to lead to more gridlock, which means you can never pass or never actually pass fiscal stimulus to get out of a recession, but B, the debt is that the European Union is going to go into is going to trigger the recession. But then, going on to our case, they give three responses to the European funding. They first say it's for geopolitical reasons, and that it's only for Chinese interest. However, our argument is that when the European Union starts funding, it's not about Chinese interest, but rather it's the polar opposite because the EU controls the funding, they control where the interest and investment actually goes. But then, they say that the BRI is not actually going to lead to investment in the AIPD response. Our evidence is really good on this. It says that France and Germany are currently seriously interested in investment. The only reason they haven't invested yet is because they don't have any benefits from it. Those benefits come from the BRI, and that's what's going to ultimately bring them into debt. They say that the European Union is not stupid and they're not going to go into debt. However, A, they give no warrants as to why this is true, and B, they will because they are going to reap massive, they believe that they're going to reap massive profits and benefits in the long term. This means that they're going to invest in infrastructure. That is what's going to streamline or shrink that the European Union is actually going to debt. They cold drop the Giladucci evidence that says that high debt is going to lead to no economic stimulus. This is very important at the point where the Romer evidence says that when recessions are 66% longer in a high debt, you're going to see that we are the only team that actually reduces the amount of fiscal debt, which means we get access to our Oxfam evidence that says for every 1 minute, you're actually going to see 100 people pushed into poverty. The significance of this is very clear. If we reduce the time of the recession, we reduce the amount of people that go into poverty, which is the cleanest link in today's round because it's very clear that the European Union is actually going to go into debt. But then, on weighing, they did none in summary, so let me make it very clear. We're going to weigh on clarity of the back because there is a 100% probability that the European Union is going to A, fund the BRI, or B, private investors are going to do it. Our Elliott evidence goes cold conceded that the European Union is currently at a high risk of recession because their growth is slumping. The reason that's important is because they are going to ultimately invest, which means that their link into a recession doesn't actually happen because countries are going to have the option to change. But more importantly, we prerequisite all of their arguments because there is no investment during a time of a recession. The team that actually solves the recession that is impending is going to more importantly win the debate because none of their offense about infrastructure investment is going to happen because there is no investment during times of recession. But then, going on to green technology quickly, they say that the push out is going to decrease emissions overall. They don't respond to the warranty here. We say that coal industrialization in the developing world is going to lead to more emissions in the developing world, which ultimately streamlines our link. They say that green technology is going to solve it. If you believe that is true, you vote negative because green technology is currently going down in price right now. The Egan evidence goes cold conceded. It says that green technology is being reduced in price by 90% right now, which means if you want to vote for the team with more, less emissions, you're going to vote negative because we see that the trend is changing now. More importantly, going on to their their case, there's a lot of issues here as well. Firstly, on the reform argument, they respond to our turn by saying it doesn't implicate corruption. However, our argument is that specifically the investment is going to go to high-income countries, which means they don't help the poor at all. They don't respond to the warranty here. The reasoning this is so significant is because they don't pull people out of poverty. It only goes to the top. They have no offense here. But more importantly, they can see the fact that Trump only proposed the $60 billion thing and that nothing actually passed. And so far as that is true, there is no offense on the infrastructure argument. But then, on the co-op debate, there's a lot of issues here. First, they cold dropped the Das Gupta evidence that says that right now we are currently solving for debt traps and being we are solving back for the lack of infrastructure because China is a really good actor. The Smith evidence goes cold drop. It says that China is going to pressure the European Union right now, which means that the only way that pressure goes away is if you would affirm and actually allow them to reform it.
Alright, everybody good?
Yeah.
Are there poor people in developing nations?
Yes.
Yeah.
So like, is there any, do you think that like, so you said that it's only gonna go to rich countries, so it's not going to help poor
Yeah,
people?
sure, it'll help some poor people in developing countries, but the way ain't gonna be really easy for
Yeah.
us. The people that are in developing countries that are poor are A, like a lot more poor, and B, don't have social nets to fall back
Yeah.
on. So like that's
Yeah,
how
we would contend because people in poorer countries with like Drew said, less developed social infrastructure, the kind of poverty that they're going to is inherently worse than the poverty of people in the developed world because they have social infrastructure and
My
networks to
problem
fall
with that
back
is
on.
that none of that was in speech. You just said that there's no poor people in developed nations, so
No, he
therefore
was saying he doesn't help the
they
poorest.
don't matter.
He said he doesn't help.
No,
the
I
You said you
did the
don't
weighing.
help poor people.
No, I
It's
did the
like-
weighing
He
that
said he
wrong.
doesn't help the poorest of the poor people that we're talking
sure.
about. Can I get a question? Of course. So I guess, let's talk about your impact about like reforms still.
Yeah.
I'm still a little confused, right?
Right.
If your argument is when the BRI becomes a lot stronger and like the US does more aid, why do they not do more aid into countries like when Italy joined?
They did. That's what we tell you in
How
summary.
much do they do?
I'm not sure. I don't have the card in front of me. But
Okay, how many
like,
people did that
insofar
card
as
target?
it wasn't like I said that they did in summary, and then you didn't respond to it in final or in your summary, I would say that it's like true. So they did.
You
Yes,
like
they
provided
did, but
no
they could have
contextualization
provided
of
like
these
$1
impacts.
of funding, right? You have no
You have
idea
A,
how
not
much they
specified
did.
the amount of funding that actually gone in, or B, the amount of people that gone into poverty, but we have specified. We said
Can we
that.
show you that the Build Act is like another example of a time when
Yeah.
China and the US
Let's-
were competing for
Let's talk
soft
about the
power
Build
in a
Act.
region.
Let's talk about
And
the
they-
Build Act. Let's talk
I
about
would
the
say
Build
that
Act.
that's enough
Let's talk about the
contextualization,
Build Act.
but sure, let's do that.
Okay, so why is the Build Act or any of that funding link specific to the Belt and Road Initiative?
Because like our card is really
Yeah,
clear.
the
This is what
card
we
says
read in
that
case,
the Build Act
Okay.
is a response to the BRI.
The Build Act is
and also it has been passed.
But doesn't that mean that by nature the Belt and Road Initiative is still inherently a separate thing from the Build Act? Even if it spawned as a result, aren't those two conflating things?
The Build Act is not in the BRI.
Okay,
Yes.
that's all we needed. Okay. Y'all have a question?
Okay, considering, like, I'll ask the same question I asked earlier. Wait, actually, I'll ask a different question. How
Okay.
does, like, more populism lead to, like,
Yeah.
them not passing a fiscal stimulus?
So it leads to more gridlock that we talk about happening in the country. So for example, if a lot of these populous countries are gaining power, then the non-populous countries are like.
So
still
what's your link into populism? It's just like people like
People fear Chinese
xenophobia.
It's your
Okay,
case.
so why did the populist Italy sign on to the BRI?
Well, we tell you specifically, Italy populism is very different than what we like
Why
in a
did
lot of these countries. Hungary,
Hungary signed on to the BRI. Another like why is every nation in the EU that has signed on to the BRI a populist nation?
So our argument is specifically that a lot of, like, the reason populism is, like, also first, this would have been great to speech, and second, we tell you specifically that the reason, like, populism is so different from the BRI is, like, the BRI is, like, it's different kind of populism, so, like, the people that fear, like, Chinese investment and the people like.
Can I get a question?
Victor
That leads to-
Orban fears.
Can I, yes, awesome. So is the price of green technology being reduced now?
Yeah,
So why do you vote F?
Because China's gonna spread green tech.
because
better.
China spreads green tech. Our warrant is like
Hold
the
on.
loaning to the, green tech to these developing nations.
That's 90% of them.
I'll take that many 20 seconds. It's gonna start populism, EU funding, green tech, and then maybe cooperation. Outside this.
Populism, sorry, what?
It's gonna start in populism, then go to like the EU forming funding and I'll just sign it. I'm ready.
Short on populism, I would say they don't ever like good bright line evidence about like, I'd say considering the fact that they believe that there's gridlock now, I'd say they don't give you a bright line on how like increasing populism is going to make the jump from whether they pass reform or not. But then let's go into the EU funding debate. I'd say call for the card. It doesn't say that France and Germany want to invest in the BRI, just as they support multilateral frameworks. And insofar as I'd say that like the EU is not going to fund for a few reasons. First is that the EU is currently in a recession. This whole cold drop, I'd say the majority of EU countries are in a recession. There's no reason they want to invest. But second, considering there's no return on investment, there's no reason they want to invest in this in the first place. But third, they don't want to further China's geopolitical norms. That's why they're not going to invest there. They say like the EU decides the projects. That's not true at all. There's no evidence for that. I'd say they don't. These projects are selected by China. But then fourthly, I would say the EU is that arguing the AIB. They can find that they want the fact that happens that proves the link. But then let's go on to their points about. Then we went to green tech. They like. On green tech, they just say like green tech, developing countries are developing now. But I would say in the long term, China's going to export green technology more. Two wars. First is they want a monopoly, but second is that green tech goes cheaper and coal gets more expensive. They want to export more green tech. They drop block and don't let them go for it. But then I would say extend to Zedek, who says that we're on pace to pass the 2-degree barrier right now. But the study site says that the only way we can actually avoid the 2-degree threshold is by affirming and joining the BRI because China will spread more green technology to countries who can't get it any other way. At that point, we solve for climate change, and that always is a few reasons. First is long term. This recession is only a one-time thing. And long term, that means it's going to affect far more people for a far longer time. And second is that we're disproportionately affecting people in the developing world far more than they are because the recession is not going to spill over that much. I say people who are not able to get food because of destroying crop yields are going to be affected far more directly. But fourthly is like on time frame, this recession is going to be over. In the long term, it's going to, the recession is going to be solved for. But then on our cooperation point, they just say that like high income, they say like they're solving for debt traps now. I would say there's no guarantee you solve for debt traps, but instead I would say that we have proven that cooperation has solved sustainability issues with the AIB. That's why I prefer our analysis. But then they say that like we don't make a warrant. I think the warrant is very clear. When countries cooperate, they make closer norms, and as a result, when you get closer norms, it will reform the BRI because now they adopt EU norms, and resulting in 32 million people out of poverty. And the reasoning for that is that even if the recession will come and go in the long term, you're still lifting people out of poverty even after the recession is over.
Alright. Starting with recessions, and then going to green tech, and then leverage. Kind of a lot. Alright. Start off with recessions. They just read the first part of our card, but if you look down to the bottom part of the card, it says France and Germany have serious interest in investing in the BRI. The reason they don't is because they don't actually get the advantage of things like infrastructure development in the long term. It's politically advantageous for these countries to invest in infrastructure development in the long term rather than caring about the debt, which is why they're going to invest. They read these like 4 responses that were in summary. First, they say it's recession right now. That was brand new in Final Focus and just simply isn't true. The Elliott evidence says it's happening later. Then they say no return. That's not true again. It was happening like things like infrastructure development in the long term brings returns. And even if it's not necessarily true, it's still politically advantageous to advocate for infrastructure development. Then they say no geopolitical needs. Again, simply not true. It doesn't interact with our response that says when the EU funds these projects and goes to developing countries, they actually get this leverage and they get this sort of like geopolitical parts that we talk about. Then they say the ARRB. Again, no reason for them to invest right now because they specifically don't get the gains of it and they don't get infrastructure development. At that point, you're going to be seeing that when they invest billions and trillions of dollars into EU projects, their debt level is going to skyrocket for the impending recession right now. There is only a risk that this actually happens specifically, which is crucial because Romer says it leads to 66% longer recessions, and Oxfam says every recession 100 people are pushed into poverty. This outweighs on a few reasons. First is clarity of impact. We tell you specifically recessions get 66% longer. How much more does China invest in green tech? How much more do renewable countries get green tech? No real clarity there. But second is a prereq because China isn't going to be investing a lot of this like renewable energy technology that we talk about during a recession. We tell you no investment happens during a recession, which means it prereqs all of their arguments. But let's go to the green tech debate. They don't respond to the fact that Egan tells you that green tech is 90% cheaper right now and developing countries are switching to it right now. Only a risk that this changes. No reason they need China, which means their terms don't make any sense. But let's go to leverage. The Das Gupta evidence gives you like reasons that they are doing it right now. And even if you don't think there's any guarantees, it doesn't change the fact that they don't respond to the Smith evidence that says that when the EU joins, it makes them seem like they've solved these problems because these are no likely changes in leverage. Recessions are the easiest place to vote. Any risk of recession controls the link of all of these arguments about green technology and about leverage. We are clearly winning.